We're group 4. This is week 7. Dane, Katy, Evan, Lena, and Charlie. There's Charlie. Chelsey stuck in traffic, getting out of school. She should be with us soon. What are we doing?
What are the steps for narrative analysis?
Just a second.
I might just share my screen so you can see it here.
All right. So these are just our like real down and dirty notes. So I'll read through, but Katy, since you have the most like knowledge, you might be able to like fill in some of this stuff for us. But basically, it follows like a lit logic, I guess. So the steps are like you interview the person, and then as you're sorting through the data, you sort of group it into like by literary terms, like characters, setting, events, conflicts, incidents, themes, resolution. And then there were some examples, like some people even did it by like self, others, family, and then they also did like past events, current events, future wonderings, like. So there's like various ways you can do it, but the point is, what was that quote you had? Is like the screen through which.
Yeah, the screen. Where is that quote?
It's something like the narrative is the screen through which the subject story makes sense.
It's a screen through which the story of the learner, the story of the whoever you're talking about, can be examined, and it becomes a way for whoever to critically reflect on earlier or current perspectives in order to construct or reconstruct meaning in their life world. But like he uses the term story map in this article. Right.
Story map. He also calls it a rubric.
Yeah, he calls it a rubric. Yeah, so you take all the data and you put it onto the story map, and then you restory it or tell the story, and then or analyze the story using like.
It's a cool way to make sense of a lot of data. Like if you did an interview and you're listening to it, like it'd be cool to just have a chart and be like, anytime they mention a character, like stick that in there. Anytime they mention an event or a conflict or a setting, just like make a list. That's kind of a nice way to like take an inventory of what's in there.
It would be interesting to organize it that way, whether it was one person over time or it's multiple people, similar event.
That's what I was thinking. I thought it would be really interesting, and they kind of do it in this one article.
Hamilton?
Yeah, I think it's Richmond. The narrative analysis. Yeah, where you have like, multiple people that you do the same interview with, and then you map out their stories all in the same way and look for like narrative similarities and things like that.
It'd be really interesting. Like the thing that I brought to Manuel's class, the writing was about a shooting that I reported on, and I homed in on one guy, but that would have been a neat approach. If you could have interviewed a lot of the shooting survivors to make sense of like the chronology and what exactly happened, and it's like chaotic event, They talk to all these people, these characters, these events, these come up, or it could even be people in certain positions in that mall. Is like in a store where people got shot. But like that would be really cool to make sense of a chaotic event, to talk to a bunch of people and code along those lines. Yeah.
So can you use narrative for any data?
Basically, it's best for story, right? So like when you want to tell like the story of somebody doing something.
Yeah, and then one of the articles, I think is it Chase?
Yeah, that chapter.
Yeah, she talks about like how there's some people who think, oh, you should take like a big story approach, so like you use it primarily with like interviews and interviewing, but there's other people who say you should take a narrative approach to like smaller like everyday interactions and things like that. So I think it's pretty open-ended. They talk about how you can use written material, interviews, spoken material, all of that. But I think so much of it, like all of these analyses, like would depend on like what your research question is, right? And like what you're trying to discover.
I suppose you could do like a phenomenological study in a narrative form. Like I was talking about, it's like the phenomenon of living through this one shooting. Or something like that, you know what I mean? Like, but it could be told as a story, as well.
Or like Evan, like retelling the story of like this powered experience of the interview.
Yeah.
I was playing with the idea of coming up with an anti-narrative or a pushback narrative that for kind of that typical power dynamic that exists in math ed interviews typically. Where the interviewer knows everything and they kind of do gotcha things in the interview, so I'm playing with that as almost like here's a way to approach that style of interview without bringing in as much power.
That's interesting. You've already kind of like laid out.
I was really stuck
Future
until about
reach,
half an hour ago.
Interesting. But now I think there's like several articles you can write out of this. Yeah, the bottom drops out.
Like, no, hold on. Okay.
The other thing I think this would be cool for is like member checking.
Yeah.
So like regurgitating the story, writing up like the actual story as you understand it, as opposed to here's the data, here's the codes I used or whatever. Like here's the story as I understand it, because story is all about meaning making, right?
Yeah.
So like part of narrative analysis is figuring out like what does this mean.
I did that with a
So-
student in Sheila Shannon's class about language. Like she didn't understand like what gentrification is and how it affected her. Like it definitely affected her, but she didn't understand what that is. And she'd been gentrified out of the neighborhood and wanted to come back and talk to her, see how her life had been. But through the process of me interviewing her, writing the story, giving it back to her to vet, then I'd say like, I've got some theory that I want to apply. We'd like talk through it together. She like learned a lot about her own situation in the way that I framed her story and attached like literature to it. You know what I mean? So for her, like deepened, maybe not deepened, it reframed her life in a way that she can make more sense of it.
It was like Mo last week in epistemology saying like, you know, like that moment when you can put language to your experience is kind of like a empowering moment. Also too, I think like the act of restoring, like they do it a lot in like therapy, you know, like when you want to show someone that you're really listening, like you tell them what you heard, like you re-story what they're telling you. Oh, it sounds like, honey, you're really upset when I don't do the dishes. Like, you know.
That's a good point, that we have a lot of responsibility with stories. I mean, stories for a lot of people are the most sacred things they have. So if you take it and fuck it up.
Yeah, I thought Chase got into the ethics of this pretty deeply, which is interesting. Yeah, who owns the story? And
you could be very voyeuristic. You could be manipulative. You could be, you know, parasite. Like, yeah, it's difficult.
So what's the difference between narrative analysis and like what you used to do as a reporter?
I think there's more steps in thinking about the data once you have it. Like, I think there's more like journalism was a lot of like I interview, I go back, I make sense of it and write it up, but I didn't make sense of it in as systematic ways. And like when Nancy Leach talks about like triangulating things, I'm not sure I triangulated everything. You know what I mean? I might have taken like one person's word for it. So I think it's just like a little bit lower bar, but it's also on a much quicker turn, which probably has a lot to do with that as well. That's a good question.
Say too, like so many of these analyses seem like, especially with qual data, maybe it's just me, like seem like kind of intuitive, right? Like if you hear someone, you know what someone's story is. I think, but like, you know, like we're all fairly adept at reframing and understanding and gathering enough data to like re-understand whoever we're encountering, right? But I think it's like this rigorous, they're trying to make it rigorous and accountable rather than, you know, I thought that with discourse analysis too, like, oh, everyone can do a linguistic analysis of whatever, but to have to take these like methodological steps and double check and blah blah blah, like take every moment, it makes you more valid and more reliable, I suppose.
Yeah, I think to a point, but then I'm definitely not a quant person, but I am with some of these, like there is a lot of room for bias, right? Like if I did a narrative analysis as like a white straight man on like a woman of color piece, like I'm bringing a lot of my identity into that, right? But if it was like quant data, there's no room for that.
But there is though, because quant data, there might not be any room in the numbers, but like it all goes back to like the instability of language, right? Like all of language is biased. So if you're collecting quant data on human beings, those questions that you're asking and the experiences that you're quantifying, you're still couching them in language.
It's true.
And
The
however
construct, which anybody who's built a bad survey knows it starts with a terrible construct or not understanding the construct, you know?
And I think Chase was talking about some researchers do a lot of their own story as part of the work. And so they examine themselves as if they're another person telling a story, and then they back up and look at that.
So I have a question, like where does this fit in because I feel like so much of what we're describing is like the art of writing, right?
Mhm.
Like self-interrogation, reflexivity, right?
Mhm.
Like the work you do with a therapist, like all this kind of stuff. So like, in what academic space can I just submit my soul-searching self-interrogation couched as a narrative research project and then get it published?
There are lots of places.
Really?
Okay?
Yeah.
Evan,
Yeah, for sure.
just lambast like my own cultural biases and
For sure. Yeah.
someone will publish it.
Well, maybe. I can't guarantee that, but yeah, I think narrative is pretty. It's coming into math ed, which is I think a fairly well-walled discipline. But it's in it, and so people are exploring anti-racist perspectives and.
Well, even like Nasir's Basketball and Math. Have you read that? Like
Yep.
that's a good example of that, right?
Yep.
Like maybe not be a straight narrative approach, but it's told more like a story than a straight up academic paper.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
I don't know, guys. This methodology, totally makes sense to me, and I kind of hate it. Like, because I feel like this social sciences approach is all about like bringing all of the absolute life out of words and life as possible, like getting it as dry and shitty as possible, and then like slapping it in like a erudite academic journal so that other people can read it and talk about it in PhD classes. And so I think I feel like a lot of resistance to this. I'm like, why just write a book? Like tell us what you know. Like why does it have to be legitimized by methodology, right? Like why is this like the legitimate way to tell a story? Like we have to go sit and read. Does that make sense?
Because it's been so illegitimized, like the practice, right? Like over years that for qual to even be like thought of in academia, you have to have like these rigid qual systems to look through. Which I know, like, why does it have to be that way? But to me, it's like standardized testing.
It is.
It's like there's like tight parameters on everything. But when you put those tighter parameters, the data means more. At least in like, writ large.
Yeah,
academia.
I mean, in terms of making a difference.
So it's kind of like playing the game. You know what I mean?
No,
like,
I know, but I rub against that. Like, I hate it. Like, it really, like, the more I thought about it, I was like, why is this bothering me? I should love it. It's so fun telling stories. And I was like, I think it's this really systematic, like, just taking the life out of language in this certain way. This,
Yeah.
But I guess you do need legitimacy as a researcher.
But you're right. Legitimacy trumps rich, thick description sometimes. Yeah.
I just call it pudding description.
Pudding? That's good. Pudding.
So how would you use this analysis with our data for homework this week?
I can talk about that a little bit. So I'm using my data to write a story for AERA, which will probably get canceled and no one will ever see this paper. But essentially, it's like a narrative of like two different school student teams' reaction during the strike. But like the interview isn't chronological, right? So I think it's interesting about like all these questions are set up in the protocol that we have, but from there I kind of have to piece together the chronology from it. So I knew I would have to do that. Like it's kind of like the work I'm doing right now. I was actually glad to see this because it gives me like a tool to more systematically do that. Because I find that step from like coded and I know what the data is, now I'm gonna write it. Like there's a big leap in there of like organization, like that type of stuff. And it's hard. And especially when you're not familiar with writing like a lit review and like in that format, it's really intimidating. So I often procrastinate before I get to that step because I don't know what the hell I'm doing. And like having these clear steps to hold on to might make more sense of what the student was saying. So I can then put it in a chronological order that makes sense. What do you all think of yours? Well, you already kind of talked about yours.
So I've been doing my analysis on the State of the Union every week. I was like,
That's gotta be.
Oh, it's intense. It's fun though. I was like, I just need this to be fun. I'm not gonna just get some data so I can be a scientist. But I was thinking, how am I gonna do a narrative analysis on this? But I think like how you could do it is like, what kind of story is he telling, right? Because there's a story in there. It's all rhetoric. He's telling us some kind of story with chronological kind of precision about here's where we were, here's where we are, right? And there's gaps that may or may not be filled in. But I think you could restory the speech to figure out this kind of like what kind of story about America is he trying to tell us?
Interesting.
Which is like unpacking ideology a little bit and stuff. So
That would be fascinating.
yeah.
That's interesting. What are you looking at? Greta Thunberg or something, right?
Yeah, her climate activist speech. So that's why I was stuck in it, because I'm doing something similar that's like a speech that she wrote and followed. So I was sort of stuck on how to do this approach.
I think with a speech, you have to take the approach not of like, what is the actual story, but what is the story being told, right? And like, if you think about it less as like, what story is she actually telling, and more of like, what is the shape of the story of this whole entire speech? Because that was what I realized, like for the discourse analysis, I maybe analyzed 2 paragraphs and I had like a 7-page analysis, you know? And so, but I think for narrative analysis, I'm going to have to zoom way out and like include a lot more to get enough data to like retell the story.
Is there any way you found a video of it? Like, I
mean, I
mean,
cannot watch that guy talk like over and over every week.
But I mean, there's definitely character involved, probably what he's talking about, like himself, and like he's probably like created nationalists.
Yeah, well,
you know,
even
like heroes
how
and
he
villains.
uses like language to like past tense, present tense, future tense. Like here's where we were, but no more this, no more that, right? Like you could restory that into figuring out like what does he think has happened in the past, and what does he think is happening now, and what does he think does the future hold?
You know, it can almost be like Donald Trump's narrative of America.
That's exactly what it is, and that's like discourse analysis. Really, like I was like, holy shit! Like I really unpacked this guy.
Hey,
no problem.
You don't control traffic.
Yeah. We are talking about narrative. Cool.
So do you use like the setting, like do you explain all of that?
I think you could use parts of it. They also, in that Richmond article, I'll show you what she has. So she has like, this is the story map. Oh, you can't see it at all. But it's like a grid. And up here she has like self, family, community, whatever. So I think you could pick out these kind of themes or ideas that you want to look at. And then she has it separated by like past, present, and future. And so then all of a sudden, if you were going to restory this, you get her idea of herself in the past, her present ideas of self, and then her future ideas. So you get the whole story of self right there.
And then you probably have like the business folks that she blames and the politicians for like being do nothing, but like parse that along the same lines. So
you can think about it in terms of like chronology, like past, present, future. You could also think about it in terms of like literary archetypes, right? Like heroes and villains. Like who is being cast as a hero? What are the implications of that? Who's being cast as a villain? What are the implications of that kind of thing?
Character setting, conflict, and then like themes and resolution. I think you can probably find that in pretty much any speech, you know? That's cool. I would have been stumped. Let's do the speech. What's your data?
I'm doing like an interview that I did with a student a couple of years ago. Well, not the whole interview, just like a piece of it.
And so we have to like make that a narrative this week.
I actually did that. I was like, I really needed to get stuff done, so I did exactly like that. Like I separated out past, present, future, and then like family, and I took out one of them, work, because there was like literally like, the student didn't work, and it just didn't make sense to include that. But
how did it go?
Fine. I wasn't really sure I was doing it right. That was the only example I found of like how it should look. So I don't really know what I was like supposed to report on for results, but I don't know. I just like kind of summarized what the different viewpoints I was able to understand by doing this process.
Cool.
And don't know if that's right. She doesn't write it yet.
We had talked before you got here. We had talked about the steps of a narrative process, and essentially like it's making that story map or rubric.
Right.
And then like these elements, character setting, event, conflict. You probably read that, but we spent time talking about that before you got here. It seems like you're coming around.
Well, yeah, I guess the only questions I did have was like, what's the other, how else could this look? Because there just wasn't any, it doesn't seem like there would be only one way to do it.
I mean, could you, so like when I heard story map, I was even thinking like the straight up like plot street, you know what I'm talking about? Like the way you like teachers teach it.
Yeah. I think you totally could.
You could, right?
You have to. I mean, I think you totally could. And then also you get so much information, and I feel like the narrative analysis is the most useful for figuring out how this person views him or herself in whatever situation, right? So it's less, I feel like to me it's less about like, let's extrapolate like cold hard ideas, and it's more about like what, you know, because the way that you tell a story, if you map it out, character, plot point, conflict, you know, you get so much insight into it, because the person is everyone's the protagonist of their own life, right?
Yeah.
So like, how are you describing yourself? What is happening to you? What do you notice? What do you not notice? All of that is.
Then once I have that and I can write up like a bare bones thing, I feel great. You know, like, because I can go back and add more description. I can go back, you know, like, but it's that step of getting from the data to that first draft where this plot street or this organizer would be, that's always been hard for me personally.
Does anyone have data that just like doesn't fit with narrative?
They were talking about speeches. That's kind of hard to do,
Oh, okay.
but they were kind of like with the Trump State of the Union. She was talking about telling like Trump's story of America, or like Charlie's got Greta Thunberg. Like who are the villains? Who are the you know, what's the main conflict? You know, what are the themes
Yeah, that's
present?
interesting.
I don't know. I mean, it'd be interesting to see what Nancy would have to say about that, but that seems cool to me.
What if you, maybe we're getting in the weeds, but like if you got data that you don't have the whole context?
Can you go back and fill it in with more interviews? Is that ethical? Okay. I'm kind of in that spot
I also
now.
think, though, I mean, maybe we are too, but I think with narrative analysis, there's other things you can analyze, right? Like you could do an okay discourse analysis without a lot of contextual information, just because so much of it is in the speech itself, so much of your analysis. And I wonder if you could do that with narrative analysis too, where you don't even know the whole story and where it fits in. You are learning about this person and their story. And I think the only thing it limits is your insights, right? Your insights are about how they view themselves or about the person themselves rather than the situation. Like for you, Dane, like it would be about how does this person like view themselves while they tell the story of the strike? Like in telling this story, what is their self?
And honestly, like
whatever.
I'm really starting to see how triangulation with various qual approaches helps you understand, because discourse analysis was huge about that. It was specifically race. It's like she mentions race a lot. So that's what I looked for in like keyword and context. Anything that was like racial. And then what was it before and how is it like, how did she think about it? And there was like various ways she thinks about race. And then I think that frames the story she tells. So like doing the discourse analysis and then writing the narrative is like really strong. Like I feel like empowered and clear with what's going on, having done that.
I think that's what's kind of cool about how she's having us do this class is like as you inch forward slowly through the slog of the semester, like you get all these new insights about the same data that you had, you know, like your data is like shifting and changing and dynamic based on how you approach it.
Yeah,
which I think is quite cool and compelling.
this was the first time I felt like I could actually say things about this data that weren't explicitly there.
Yeah.
Like I could do more of what I know from this student because I know the student, and include that. And also, actually, I guess I felt like that with discourse analysis too, because of like the framing.
But then it'd be interesting for like your data, you know the student, then to do, would that be member checking or like
Or have Charlie do a
else do
narrative
it, like-
analysis. Someone who doesn't do that.
Oh yeah, I feel like that would have been
super interesting.
harder.
I think so too.
So like if I did the plot street and then you did the plot street,
Yeah.
like even before you start writing it, how close are they? Or if you did that rubric or whatever.
Yeah.
And it'd be interesting because if you like did the interview in person, you'd probably remember like nonverbals that if she's just reading a transcript.
Yeah.
Right. Good point.
I'll
Or if you
say
had audio, if you had
anybody wants
video. Yeah.
some stranger to restore their data, I'm so down. Like right in my alley. I'm like, I'll do this for you in an afternoon, no problem.
I might need to take you up on that. That fucking the one about the gentrification of that girl is such a clusterfuck because I like gave it for Antoine's class too, and like it turned into something different. I know I don't know how to get it back.
Yeah,
Okay.
I'll help you.
Cool.
No problems.
Yeah. All right. Anything else? We good?
I just sent 2 articles that have a different approach to narrative.
Okay.
but
Sweet.
I don't know if
That's
it would be
awesome.
helpful, but
Yeah.
I feel like this is like one of the first ones where it's so like emergent, right? Like that there's so many different ways to do it.
That's
They're all
exciting.
okay.
To me.
I think so too.
Yeah.
But I think too it's probably helpful to read especially like the analysis, like results, and then the discussion. What are people saying? What are they concluding?
Yeah, just reading articles makes like, it's like, oh, this is how you do this. Oh, this is how you do this part. Oh, the story is like self-contained. You know, like that's hard too. Like pulling out like the intro that's maybe part of the narrative, but then going back and having the whole narrative contained in like the things. You know, like, and then you got to stick
No,
with
then it gets
methods.
all
And,
awkward.
yeah, it's all
awkward.
awkward. That's
But
also
that's
where
why
I'm
you
fucking
don't do it. That's why
Right.
they say you reject like this phallic, penetrative search for truth, and you say, I am writing this differently because I can't stand bad writing.
Yeah.
And
That's cool.
fuck the social sciences if that's what they want.
The first thing I thought of when you said you rejected is you reject the null. How many times?
We always
Reject the null.
Rejecting them all. All right, I think we're
Just
good.
say reject the dull.
Hey,
Whoa.
somebody's a
Yeah.
mom. All right. Thanks.
Thanks.